Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Glad to have you here for another quiet inquiry. Tell me, do you ever wonder what old paper remembers long after the ink has faded? A boundary once falsely drawn, a name once quietly erased? Watson believed that truth, however buried, never truly rests. Do subscribe so no margin goes unread. Now, settle in. For as Holmes knew well, the earth and the page forgets nothing. Find us also on Spotify. Link below. Chapter 1. The Gentleman of Alderwick Hall. It was in the closing days of November, in a year which I have elsewhere had occasion to describe as unusually bleak, even for that dismal season, that Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves summoned upon a matter which was to prove, before its conclusion, one of the strangest and most melancholy investigations in which I ever had the privilege of assisting him. The fog had settled early over Baker Street that afternoon, and I recall that Holmes was standing at the window, his violin laid aside, watching the lamplighters move like pale ghosts along the pavement below. When Mrs. Hudson announced that a telegram had arrived, Holmes read it twice before passing it to me. Come at once if convenient. If inconvenient, come all the same. A matter of the gravest delicacy. Sir Edmund Harcourt, Alderwick Hall, Surrey. You know the name? I asked. I know the family, said Holmes, reaching for his pipe. An old Surrey line, Watson, respectable to the point of dullness, and possessed of an estate that has grown steadily larger with each generation, though I confess I have never troubled myself to inquire how. We shall take the 4:15 from Waterloo, and you would do well to bring your revolver, though I have no present reason to think we shall need it. We arrived at Alderwick Hall as the last grey light was failing over the park. It was a handsome house, built in the reign of the Second George, with tall windows that now stood dark and a portico beneath which a manservant waited to receive us with an anxious civility that told me something of the household's temper before ever we crossed the threshold. Sir Edmund himself met us in the library, a tall, spare gentleman of some 68 years, with the erect bearing of one who has spent a lifetime upon horseback, and the pale, composed face of one long practised in the concealment of his feelings. Yet I, who had by then some years of experience in reading the smaller signs of distress in Holmes's clients, observed that his hand trembled very slightly as he motioned us to be seated, and that his eyes moved continually to a small drawer in his writing desk, as though he feared, even in our presence, to leave it unguarded. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I must begin by confessing that I am not entirely certain why I have sent for you. I have received no threat that any magistrate would trouble himself over. I have suffered no loss that I can name, and yet I am persuaded that something is very wrong in this house, and I find that I can no longer carry the burden of not knowing what it is." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "you will permit me to see the notes." Sir Edmund started visibly. "I did not say that I had received any notes. You did not need to, Sir Edmund. You have glanced no fewer than 4 times at that drawer since we entered the room, and a man does not guard an empty drawer so carefully." Our host regarded Holmes for a long moment, and then, with the air of one submitting to the inevitable, unlocked the drawer and produced 3 sheets of plain notepaper. Upon each, in a hand that was careful, unhurried, and entirely without ornament, was written a single sentence. The boundary was never yours. Holmes studied the papers with that peculiar stillness which I had long since learned to recognise as the outward sign of his most concentrated thought. He held each sheet to the lamp, examined the quality of the paper and smelled it, before laying them upon the table. "They came by post?" "The first 2, yes, though bearing no return direction, and postmarked from the village. The third was found upon this very desk 3 mornings ago, though no servant admits to having seen any stranger enter the house." "And the phrase conveys nothing to you?" It was here that I observed what I can only describe as the central mystery of that evening, and one which was to occupy my thoughts long after we had retired. For at this simple question, Sir Edmund's composure, which had held through the recitation of anonymous threats and midnight intrusions, broke for one unguarded instant. It was not fear that crossed his features, or not fear alone. It was something closer to recognition, the look of a man confronted suddenly with a debt he had believed long since forgotten. "Nothing whatever," said he, recovering himself. "It is nonsense. A tenant's grievance, perhaps, or the work of some madman." Holmes said nothing further upon the matter, though I could see that he had marked the moment as carefully as I had. We dined that evening with the household, and it was there that I first observed the other figures in this singular drama. Charles Harcourt, the baronet's nephew and heir presumptive, was a handsome, restless young man whose conversation was animated, but whose eyes, I thought, held something calculating beneath their charm. Miss Eleanor Vale, engaged some months previously to catalogue the family archives, was a quiet, dark-haired young woman of perhaps 30, whose replies were courteous but brief, and who seemed throughout the meal more occupied with her own thoughts than with the company. Dr. Matthew Fenwick, the family physician, and, as I understood, a companion of Sir Edmund's from boyhood, watched our host with an attentiveness that went beyond mere professional habit. And Mr. Silas Trent, the estate solicitor, proved an urbane and practical man, full of easy reassurance, who seemed genuinely devoted to the family's affairs. It was during the second course that Holmes, in the most casual manner imaginable, remarked upon the Parliamentary Enclosure Acts of the previous century, and observed how curious it was that so many old estates owed their present boundaries to legislation now half forgotten. Sir Edmund's wine-glass slipped from his fingers and shattered upon the table. For a moment nobody spoke. A servant hastened forward with a cloth. Charles laughed a little too loudly and made some remark about his uncle's nerves. Miss Vale grew very pale and did not lift her eyes from her plate. Dr. Fenwick half rose from his chair before catching himself. Only Mr. Trent retained an entirely untroubled countenance, and it was he who smoothly turned the conversation to some trifling matter of the harvest. But I had seen Holmes's face in that instant, and I knew, as surely as I have ever known anything in the course of our long association, that he had found the thread by which the whole tangled skein would eventually be unwound. "Watson," he murmured to me later, as we climbed the stairs to our rooms, candles in hand, "I begin to suspect that Sir Edmund Harcourt is not merely afraid. He is guilty of something, and has been guilty of it for a very long time." Chapter 2. The Locked Cabinet. I woke the following morning to find a thin, cold sunlight struggling through the curtains, and the sound of Holmes already moving about in the room adjoining mine. By the time I dressed and come down, he had breakfasted, or rather had taken 2 cups of black coffee in place of breakfast, and was standing in Sir Edmund's study with his hands clasped behind his back, regarding an oaken document cabinet as though it were a witness under cross-examination. "You have been busy," I observed. "I have been thinking, which is not always the same occupation, though the household has been kind enough to permit me the study to myself since 6 o'clock. Come here, Watson, and tell me what you make of this lock." I bent to examine it. The cabinet was old, of dark oak bound with iron, and the lock, though sound, bore fresh scratches about its keyhole, bright against the tarnished metal. "Someone has forced it?" "Someone has opened it with a key not perfectly suited to the mechanism, and has done so hurriedly, in poor light, and very probably within the last 24 hours. Observe that the scratches are new. There is no dust settled within them, whereas the surrounding ironwork has not been polished in a year. Whoever came here last night knew the cabinet's importance, but not the exact shape of its key. Was anything taken? That is the interesting part. Nothing that Sir Edmund will admit to missing." Holmes drew open the heavy door, revealing shelves of deeds, leases, surveyors' rolls, and bundles of parliamentary papers tied with faded ribbon, each bearing a small label in a clerkish hand. He ran his long fingers along them until he stopped at a gap. "Here," said he, and lifted down a folder from which the ribbon still hung empty and untied. Upon its cover, in ink gone brown with age, was written, "Enclosure Proceedings, 1879. "The folder is empty," I said, somewhat unnecessarily. "The folder is empty," Holmes agreed, "and I should like very much to know what it contained, and even more to know why our host, when I asked him not 10 minutes ago what these particular papers concerned, replied that they were worthless historical records not worth a candle's light, and yet could not bring himself to tell me whether he had ever read them." We found Sir Edmund at breakfast, looking, I thought, older than he had appeared the previous evening, as though the night had cost him something he could ill afford to lose. He received the news of the Cabinet's disturbance with a calm that seemed to me deliberately constructed, and repeated, almost word for word, his assertion that the missing papers could be of no possible consequence to anyone. It was Miss Vale who supplied us, later that morning, with the history that Sir Edmund seemed so reluctant to furnish. We found her in the long gallery that served as the estate's archive room, surrounded by boxes of documents through which she was working with a quiet, methodical patience that I confess I found rather admirable. "The Enclosure of 1879, said she, when Holmes had put his question, "was the making of this estate, Mr. Holmes, or very nearly. Before that year, Alderwick was a comfortable property, but no more than that. The Act absorbed a great deal of common land into the Harcourt holdings, together with several cottages and their attendant rights of pasture. It was not an unusual proceeding for its time, whatever one may think of it now. And the villagers who lost their rights? Compensated, according to the official record, though I have found the compensation curiously difficult to trace in the parish accounts." She said this last with a carefulness that struck me as significant, though I could not then have said why. Dr. Fenwick, whom we encountered shortly afterward upon the terrace, dismissed the whole matter with a wave of his hand. "Ancient history, Mr. Holmes. I cannot conceive why you trouble yourself with the boundaries of fields that were settled before either of us was born. A man was troubled enough to write 3 letters upon the subject," Holmes reminded him mildly, "and troubled enough, it would seem, to break open a cabinet in the night to prevent others from reading what those letters concerned." The doctor's ruddy face lost something of its colour, but he said only that he could offer no help in so old a business, and excused himself with more haste than courtesy. We fared no better with Mr. Trent, whom we found in the estate office attending to a quantity of correspondence with the brisk efficiency of a man who regarded paperwork as a personal friend. He received Holmes's questions with every appearance of open cooperation, suggesting, with a reasonable and untroubled air, that some collector of local antiquities might well have taken a fancy to old parliamentary documents, and that such thefts, while regrettable, were hardly unheard of in country houses possessed of interesting archives. A very tidy explanation, Holmes remarked to me afterward, as we walked together in the bare, frost-touched garden. "Almost too tidy, Watson. I have observed that when 4 persons in one household each offer, independently and without apparent collusion, a separate reason for indifference to the very same missing paper, it is rarely because the paper is truly unimportant. It is far more often because each of them fears that it is not. You believe they are all concerned in it? I believe that Sir Edmund fears what the papers might reveal about himself, that Dr. Fenwick fears it from loyalty to his old friend, or perhaps from some closer implication, that Mr. Trent, whose business is the management of legal papers, would fear any disturbance that might expose an irregularity for which his office bears responsibility, and that Miss Vale, unlike the others, does not fear the truth at all, but is hunting for it with a single-mindedness that a mere archivist's salary would scarcely justify. And the notes? The boundary was never yours? That, my dear Watson, is the sentence upon which the whole matter will eventually turn, though we do not yet possess enough of the story to read it rightly. A boundary is not merely a line upon a map, it is a claim, and where there is a false claim of long standing, there is very often, somewhere beneath it, a wrong that has never been righted. We returned to the house as the light was failing, and I confess that I retired to dress for dinner with an uneasy sense, which I could not then have justified by any fact that the household about us was holding its breath, waiting for some blow that none of its members had the courage to name. I did not know, as I fastened my collar in the fading light, how very soon that blow would fall, nor how little warning we should have of its coming. Chapter 3. Death in the Map Room. Sir Edmund did not come down to dinner. At first no one remarked upon it beyond the ordinary courtesies. Mr. Trent observed that our host had seemed fatigued since morning, and Charles suggested, with a carelessness I thought slightly forced, that his uncle had likely fallen asleep over his correspondence. But when the second course had come and gone without any word from him, Dr. Fenwick rose from the table with an abruptness that betrayed more concern than his words allowed, and went himself to inquire. He returned within a few minutes, and I have rarely seen a man's face so changed in so short a space. He said nothing intelligible at first, only that we must come, all of us, and at once, and it was Holmes who took charge of the company and bade the ladies remain where they were until we had learned the nature of the trouble. We found Sir Edmund in the map room, a small chamber at the end of the eastern corridor where the estate's older surveys were kept, framed upon the walls. He lay upon the floor beside the great parish map, a survey of considerable age mounted upon a broad table, and it was evident from the first glance that no earthly summons would rouse him again. His face, though composed, wore an expression that struck me as one of profound and unfinished thought, as though death had interrupted him in the very act of understanding something. The windows, I observed, were secured upon the inside, and the door had been found unlocked but drawn to, in the manner of a room left in confidence rather than haste. There was no sign whatever of any struggle. The papers upon the table lay in their accustomed order, save for one corner of the great map, which had been disturbed as though a hand had rested upon it in its owner's final moment. Inspector Lestrade, who had been summoned from the county constabulary, and arrived within the hour with the brisk self-assurance I had come to associate with him, was inclined from the first to a straightforward reading of the matter. A half-empty glass of brandy stood upon a small table near the body, and beneath it, fallen or perhaps thrust out of sight, lay a small medicine bottle bearing Dr. Fenwick's name upon its label. "Poison, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with the satisfaction of a man who believes the difficult part of his work already accomplished. "A man does not die like that, sitting quiet in his chair with his glass beside him, from any natural cause." "He does not," Holmes agreed, "though I would ask you to observe, Lestrade, that Sir Edmund is not sitting in his chair. He has fallen from it, and fallen moreover toward the table rather than away from it, which is not invariably the case with a man overcome suddenly where he sits." Lestrade was not to be deterred from his theory, and I confess that upon the medical evidence available to us that evening, I could not myself have argued strongly against him. Dr. Fenwick, summoned to examine his old friend's body, performed the office with hands that shook so visibly that Holmes at length suggested another physician be sent for from the village, a suggestion Fenwick received with something between relief and wounded pride. It was Charles Harcourt, however, upon whom suspicions settled most readily and most swiftly. His debts, as I had gathered from occasional remarks about the house, were considerable, and not easily concealed from a country neighbourhood accustomed to knowing its own business, and it required no great subtlety of reasoning to observe that Sir Edmund's death made him, at a stroke, master of Alderwick Hall and all its revenues. Lestrade's eye rested upon him with open and growing interest, and Charles, to his credit or otherwise, seemed fully aware of the direction of the inspector's thoughts, and grew pale and defensive under it in a manner that did his case no particular good. Holmes, meanwhile, gave the brandy glass and the medicine bottle scarcely a second glance. He moved instead to the doorway, where the household had gathered in a huddle of dressing-gowns and candlelight, and I watched him study their faces with the close, unhurried attention he generally reserved for physical evidence rather than human countenance, though I had learned over the years that he trusted the second quite as much as the first. Charles stood white and trembling, and I judged his horror, whatever else might be said of him, entirely genuine. Miss Vale was pale also, but there was a watchfulness in her expression, a quality of calculation beneath the shock, that I found harder to read. Dr. Fenwick's fright seemed to me the fright of man confronted with something he had long dreaded, rather than something wholly unexpected. And Mr. Trent, alone among them, wore an expression which I could not at first name, and which Holmes, when we spoke of it later that night, described with characteristic precision as relief, disguised, not very successfully, as professional concern. "Relief, Holmes," I said. "The man has just learned that his employer and, I collect, his friend of many years is dead. And yet, Watson, a man's face in the first unguarded instant of shock will tell you what he fears has happened, or what he is glad has not. Trent's face, for 1/2 of 1 second, told me that some blow he had been dreading had been averted rather than delivered. I should like very much to know what blow that was." It was Lestrade himself kneeling to examine the floor beneath the dead man's outstretched hand, who made the discovery that was to occupy Holmes's thoughts for the remainder of that night. Caught beneath the stiffened fingers was a small fragment of parchment, torn raggedly from some larger sheet, blackened faintly at one edge, as though it had been near a flame. Upon it, in a hand none of us at first recognised, were 3 surviving words, the remainder of the sentence lost with the missing portion of the page, "rights of common." Lestrade turned the fragment over in his fingers with the puzzled air of a man who has found a key to a lock he cannot yet locate. Holmes said nothing at all, but I saw him glance once toward the great parish map upon the table, and then toward the cabinet 2 floors below, whose empty folder we had examined that very morning, and I understood, though he offered no word of explanation, that in his mind the threads of the enclosure papers, the anonymous notes, and this final dying fragment had already begun to draw themselves together into a single dark design. We did not sleep that night, any of us, and I remember the map room long after the body had been removed, the great survey of Alderwick parish lying open upon its table beneath the lamp, as though it alone among all the household had kept its secrets whole. Chapter 4. The Erased Boundary. Daylight, when it came, brought little comfort to Alderwick Hall, but it brought Holmes back to the map room with a fresh and evident purpose, and I followed him there before either of us had troubled to break our fast. "You slept, Watson?" "Very little. And you?" "Not at all, though I have not been idle." He drew back the heavy curtain to admit what grey light the morning offered, and turned at once to the great survey of the parish that lay still spread upon the table, its corner disturbed exactly as we had found it the night before, save that the body which had lain beside it was now gone. He bent low over the map, his lens in hand, and was silent for a long while. "Come here," said he at last, "and tell me what you observe along this line." I looked as he directed, tracing with my eye a thin ink boundary that ran across a portion of the parish marked, in faded copper plate, as the Western Fields. To my unpractised sight it appeared no different from 100 other such lines upon the survey. "I see a boundary, Holmes, and very little else." "You see a boundary that has been altered. Look here, where the light falls obliquely across the surface, and you will observe a faint roughness in the paper's grain, quite different from the smooth, unbroken texture elsewhere upon the sheet. The original line has been carefully scraped away, and a fresh one drawn some inches to the west of it. It is very finely done, Watson, done by a hand accustomed to such work, and would deceive any eye not deliberately searching for it." "To what purpose?" "To move a boundary, my dear fellow, is to move a fortune, if the boundary in question separates a common field from private land. Someone has taken several acres from one side of this line and given them, upon paper at least, to the other. The only question that concerns us now is when this was done, and by whom, though I confess the map itself will not yet answer the second question, however patiently I examine it." It was while Holmes was thus occupied that Lestrade, who had spent the earlier hours of the morning conducting a search of Sir Edmund's private rooms with the thoroughness his profession demanded, brought us a discovery of his own. In the small grate of the study, among the cold ashes of the previous night's fire, he had found several fragments of burned paper, charred at the edges but not wholly consumed, and bearing upon their blackened surface the remnants of a letter written in a hand none of us could immediately place, Holmes spread the fragments upon a sheet of white paper with the delicate patience of a man restoring some ancient and precious manuscript, and after the better part of an hour's labour was able to piece together, from among the scattered scraps, the greater part of a single sentence. What happened to Abel Mercer must finally be acknowledged. "Mercer," said Lestrade, frowning. "I know no one of that name in this household, Mr. Holmes, nor has anyone I have questioned this morning admitted to knowing it either." We put the question in turn to each member of the household, and received in each case the same denial, offered with varying degrees of conviction. Charles professed entire ignorance, and I believed him. Dr. Fenwick's denial was brief to the point of curtness. Mr. Trent's was smooth and unhesitating. But it was Miss Vale's answer that Holmes afterward pronounced the most significant of all, though upon its face it was no different from the rest. "I have never encountered any such name in the archives," said she, when Holmes questioned her in the long gallery, and her composure, I thought, was entirely convincing. Yet not 5 minutes later, as she was explaining some point regarding the family's land holdings, she observed, in the most natural manner imaginable, that certain difficulties in the parish accounts might be connected to what she called the Mercer matter, and coloured deeply the instant the words had left her lips. Holmes said nothing at the time, but I saw him mark the slip as carefully as a naturalist marks the track of some rare and elusive creature. It was Lestrade, however, whose investigations that afternoon produced the discovery which he plainly regarded as decisive. A groom, questioned regarding the state of the household in the days before Sir Edmund's death, recalled a heated exchange between the baronet and his nephew, occurring some 8 or 9 days previously, in which raised voices had been heard through the library door, and the words "sell" and "never while I live" had been distinguished among them. Further inquiry among the servants produced a second and more damaging rumour, whispered, rather than stated outright, that Sir Edmund had lately consulted his solicitor upon the question of altering his will, with a view, it was thought, to removing his nephew's expectations altogether. Lestrade received this intelligence with the satisfaction of a man whose case has been rendered, in his own estimation, complete. A quarrel, a threatened disinheritance, a fortune at stake, and the fortunate heir left alone in a house from which no stranger could be shown to have come or gone. It wanted, to his mind, no further embellishment. "It is a very tidy theory, Lestrade," Holmes observed that evening, as we sat together in the small sitting-room that had been placed at our disposal. "It is a very sound one, Mr. Holmes, whatever your private reservations may be. I have not questioned its soundness. I have questioned only its completeness. You have explained why a man might wish his uncle dead. You have not explained why that same man's uncle, 3 nights running, received unsigned letters accusing him of a wrong committed nearly 50 years before Charles Harcourt was born, nor why a cabinet of ancient parliamentary papers was disturbed in the night, nor why a parish map, untouched perhaps for a generation, has lately had its boundaries redrawn by a careful and knowing hand, nor why a dying man's last conscious act was to clutch a fragment bearing the words "rights of common." A motive so recent as a quarrel over money does not, I think, account for evidence so old as this. Lestrade had no ready answer, and contented himself with the observation, not wholly unreasonable, that clever men were forever finding complications in cases that plainer men solved by supper-time. "Perhaps," said Holmes when the inspector had gone, "and perhaps, Watson, the plainer men are occasionally right, but I do not think it so in this instance. There is an older debt behind this murder, incurred long before Charles Harcourt learned to spend more than his allowance permitted, and I mean to trace it to its source, though it should carry us back half a century to do so." Chapter 5. The Cottage Beyond the Wall. We set out the following morning upon foot, for Holmes declared that a walk across the disputed ground would serve his purposes better than any carriage, and I confess that after the closeness of the house, with its watchful faces and unspoken suspicions, I welcomed the sharp air of the Surrey countryside with something like relief. Holmes had spent the earlier hours of the morning among the estate's older surveys, and it was from a faded tithe map, its corners softened with handling, that he had identified our destination. A ruined cottage standing at the far edge of the Harcourt land, beyond a low stone wall that marked, or had once marked, the boundary between the estate and what remained of the village common. Upon the old map the dwelling bore a name written in a clerk's careful hand: Mercer's Cottage. "You will observe, Watson," said Holmes, as we picked our way along a muddy cart track between bare hedgerows, "that this name appears upon no map made after 1880. The cottage is there still, or its ruin is, but its name has been quietly dropped from every subsequent survey, as though someone wished the very memory of its owner to fade along with its roof. The cottage itself, when we reached it, proved a melancholy sight. 4 low walls of flint and mortar, roofless and half overgrown with ivy that had climbed in through the empty window frames, as though nature itself had determined to erase what human hands had abandoned. Yet close beside it stood a small, well-tended garden, and a cottage of more recent construction, from whose chimney a thin trail of smoke rose into the cold air, and it was here that we found the old man who was to furnish us with the history Sir Edmund had been so unwilling to relate. He gave his name as Josiah Pratt, and though well past 80, his memory of the district's affairs proved remarkably clear, the more so, I suspected, for having been rehearsed many times before an audience of his own grandchildren upon winter evenings. "Mercer's Cottage, you say, sir?" He regarded Holmes with the shrewd, unhurried appraisal of a countryman long accustomed to strangers with questions. "Aye, I mind it well enough, though it were before my own time as a grown man. My father told the tale often, and I've no reason to doubt the truth of it, whatever the quality up at the Hall might prefer folk to believe." "We should be glad to hear it," said Holmes, seating himself upon the low wall with an air of unhurried patience that I knew concealed the keenest attention. "There was a tenant farmer here, Abel Mercer his name, near 50 year gone now, that held certain rights upon the common land beyond that wall, same as his father before him, and his father's father for that matter. Grazing rights and turf cutting and the like, such as many a poor family depended on in those days. Then came the Enclosure, and much of that common land was took into the Hall's own fields, all lawful and proper, so they said, with an Act of Parliament behind it. And Mercer accepted this? That he did not, sir, not at first. My father said Mercer went about the village declaring the Act had been tampered with, that the paper laid before Parliament weren't the paper as was finally put on record, and that a deal of good common land had been slipped into the Hall's pocket, that no honest act ever intended for it. He made a deal of noise about it, wrote letters, threatened to go to law. And then, the old man's face grew grave. And then, sir, he vanished, gone to Canada, so it was given out, seeking his fortune same as many another disappointed man of that generation. But my father never believed it, not for 1 hour of his life. Mercer had a wife and a little daughter here, sir, and no man leaves a wife and daughter behind him without a farewell, nor without so much as a letter following after, which is more than ever came from Canada, for all anyone in this village ever heard." Holmes asked several further questions, patient and unhurried, concerning the precise date of Mercer's disappearance, and the names of those who had been prominent in the district at that time. And it was in answer to this last inquiry that Josiah Pratt furnished us with information that I saw strike Holmes with particular force, though his countenance betrayed scarcely a flicker of it. There was young Master Edmund up at the Hall, not yet come into his inheritance in those days, and young Fenwick, the doctor's son, that were his particular friend from boyhood, and young Trent, too, whose father was clerk to the old solicitor in the town, and liked to follow him in the profession, as indeed he did. The 3 of them were forever about together in those years, sir, thick as thieves, if you'll forgive the expression, seeing as how it may prove nearer the truth than I intended. And Mercer's daughter, said Holmes. What became of her? Married out of the district, sir, so far as I recall, and I could not tell you more than that. It is a long while ago now, and an old man's memory grows uncertain past a certain point. We thanked him for his trouble, and Holmes, with a courtesy I had seen him extend to few witnesses of higher station, left a sum of money upon the cottage table that I judged considerably in excess of the information's ordinary value, though not, I thought, in excess of its worth to our investigation. It was upon our walk back toward the hall that Holmes fell into a silence broken only once, when he remarked, apparently apropos of nothing, that Miss Vale's mother had been born, according to the parish register he had consulted 2 days previously, under the name of Mercer. Her grandmother, said he, unless I am very much mistaken, which would make our quiet historian Watson not merely a scholar with an antiquarian interest in old boundaries, but the granddaughter of the very man whose disappearance we have this morning begun to trace. She has not come to Alderwick Hall merely to catalogue its papers. She has come looking for proof of what became of her grandfather, and I think we may now be reasonably confident that she has found rather more than she expected. Do you believe she killed Sir Edmund? Holmes did not answer at once. I believe, said he at length, that we have 3 men who once stood together at a boundary wall nearly 50 years ago, and that one of those 3 men is now dead. I believe further, Watson, that whatever occurred upon that night in 1879 has never truly ended, but has merely waited, like a debt-gathering interest, for the day when it must at last be paid. Chapter 6. 4 Young Men in 1879. We returned to Alderwick Hall to find that Lestrade had spent the morning in a manner very different from our own, having occupied himself with a close examination of the household's more recent affairs, and greeted us with the air of a man who considers the antiquarian excursions of amateurs to be a diverting, if somewhat wasteful, use of a murder investigation's limited hours. You have been chasing an old farmer's tale, I hear, Mr. Holmes, while I have been securing statements that will stand in a court of law. I am obliged to tell you that the case against Charles Harcourt grows stronger with every hour. I have no doubt of it, said Holmes, with a courtesy that did not entirely conceal his impatience, and I should be glad to hear your evidence presently, Lestrade, if you will grant me first an hour's use of the library and Sir Edmund's private correspondence. The inspector, grumbling a little, consented, and it was in the quiet of that library, with the fire burning low and the last light failing beyond the tall windows, that Holmes set himself to the task of reconstructing, from fragments of old letters, parish records, and the testimony we had gathered that morning, the events of a night nearly 50 years gone. Let us consider what we know, said he, settling into a deep chair with his fingertips pressed together in the attitude I had come to associate with his most careful reasoning. In the year 1879, Sir Edmund's father, then master of this estate, sought to enlarge his holdings by means of a parliamentary enclosure. Such proceedings were common enough in that generation, and there is nothing in the original bill, so far as the official record shows, that was not entirely lawful. The schedule attached to it, however, is another matter. You believe the schedule was altered? I am now all but certain of it. A schedule of this kind lists with precision which parcels of land are to pass into private hands and which are to remain common. If a schedule so drawn were quietly replaced, after the bill had passed through Parliament, but before the final documents were deposited for registration, the alteration would be exceedingly difficult to detect, provided it were done by someone with intimate knowledge of the legal process, and provided further that no one troubled afterward to compare the deposited schedule against the version originally read before the House. Someone such as a solicitor's clerk, I said, beginning to see the shape of his meaning. Someone precisely such as a solicitor's clerk, Watson, and I think we need look no further than the elder Mr. Trent, father to our present acquaintance, who held that very position in the town at the time in question. It would have wanted only a steady hand, a familiarity with the proper forms, and an employer, or a patron, willing to reward such a service handsomely and discreetly. Sir Edmund's father? Very probably, though I do not think the 3 young men we have identified, Edmund, Fenwick, and the younger Trent, were themselves the architects of the original fraud. They were, I believe, no more than schoolboys grown to young manhood when it was committed, and inherited its consequences rather than its design. But Abel Mercer, whose family's rights had been quietly folded into the Harcourt estate under cover of that altered schedule, discovered the substitution, or came near enough to discovering it to be dangerous, and he did not confine his suspicions to muttering in the village alehouse. He wrote letters. He threatened to carry his complaint to law. And the 3 young men learned of it, and met with him, Watson, I have little doubt, upon the very boundary his family had lost, to persuade him, by whatever means young men in a difficult position generally employ, to abandon his complaint. Whether violence was intended from the first, I cannot yet say. But a confrontation followed, and Abel Mercer did not live to see the sun rise upon the following morning. It was at this point that Dr. Fenwick, whom neither of us had heard enter, spoke from the doorway in a voice so altered from his customary cheerful manner that I scarcely recognised it. You have pieced it together well enough, Mr. Holmes, though I think you credit us with more calculation than the truth allows. Holmes turned without any appearance of surprise, as though he had expected the physician's presence all along. Then perhaps you will complete the account yourself, Doctor, rather than leave me to guess at it. Fenwick came slowly into the room and sank into a chair with the movements of a man very much older than his years. There was an accident, said he after a long silence. I will say that much, and no more, Mr. Holmes, for I gave my word nearly 50 years ago, and a man's word does not become worthless merely because the keeping of it grows heavier with time. An accident, Holmes repeated, upon the boundary wall, I think, near the quarry that lies beyond it. Fenwick's silence was answer enough. And Sir Edmund's murder, Holmes pressed gently, cannot, I am now convinced, be understood by any man who does not first understand precisely what happened upon that earlier night. The 2 deaths are not separate matters, Doctor. They are the same matter, separated by 50 years, and I mean to have the whole of it before I leave this house. But Fenwick, whatever guilt or grief pressed upon him, would say no more, and rose at last and left the room with the unsteady gait of a man carrying a burden too long, concealed to be easily set down, even under the most pressing necessity. When he had gone, Holmes sat for a long while in silence, gazing into the dying fire. You believe him complicit in Mercer's death, I said, yet not in Sir Edmund's. I believe, Watson, that a man may carry one crime upon his conscience for 50 years, and yet be entirely innocent of a second committed only 3 nights ago. Grief and guilt do not always walk hand in hand with present villainy. Very often, indeed, they walk in quite the opposite direction, driving a man to protect a secret he had no part in creating, merely because he once helped, in his youth and his fear, to bury it. Then who, Holmes? Trent? I do not yet know, Watson, though I confess my thoughts turn increasingly in that direction. But I will not accuse a man upon inference alone, when the physical evidence of this case has not yet spoken its final word. Tomorrow we shall examine that map once more, and I think before the day is out, it will tell us a great deal that 50 years of silence have so far concealed. Chapter 7. The Historian's Revenge. I had scarcely finished dressing the following morning when Lestrade's voice, raised in a tone of considerable excitement, reached me from the corridor below, and I came down to find him standing outside Miss Vale's door with 2 constables and an expression of a man who believes his case at long last entirely made. You will wish to see this, Mr. Holmes, said he, and there was in his manner none of the grudging courtesy he had shown us the previous evening, but rather the frank triumph of a professional who feels, not without some justice, that the amateur has been outpaced. Miss Vale's room, when we entered it, presented a sight that gave me, I confess, a sharp pang of dismay upon her behalf, whatever suspicions Holmes's inquiries had lately raised concerning her. Spread upon the small writing table were copies, evidently made in her own hand, of the altered parish map we had examined 2 days before, a bundle of letters and certificates tracing, through 3 generations, her descent from Abel Mercer, and several pages of closely written notes in which she had set down, with the dispassionate precision of the trained historian, her conviction that the Harcourt family's fortune rested upon a fraud committed against her own ancestor. "And this, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, producing a small stoppered vial from among a case of chemical preparations upon her dressing table. "Our county analyst has examined already, at my particular request, and finds it consistent in its essential constituents with a residue discovered in the brandy glass beside Sir Edmund's body." Holmes took the vial and turned it thoughtfully in his fingers, but said nothing, and it was left to Lestrade to complete, with evident satisfaction, the theory that these discoveries appeared to support. "She is a preserver of old documents, Mr. Holmes, as her own notes will show, and such preservation requires chemicals not unlike those that killed Sir Edmund. She discovered, through her researches, the truth of what was done to her grandfather. She confronted her employer with it, and when he would not or could not give her the satisfaction she sought, she resolved to see justice done by her own hand, however irregular the method. I will own that, hearing the case thus laid out, with its evidence so neatly assembled, I found it for a moment entirely convincing, and I said as much to Holmes as we withdrew to allow Lestrade to complete his search. "It is a very persuasive account, Watson," Holmes agreed, though something in his tone suggested that persuasion and truth were not, in his estimation, invariably the same commodity. "I should like, nonetheless, to hear it from the lady herself before I accept it as final." We found Miss Vale in the small parlour where Lestrade's constables had conducted her, pale but composed, and possessed of a dignity that I thought did her considerable credit under circumstances that would have unsettled a far less resolute character. "I will not pretend to you, Mr. Holmes, that I came to this house merely to catalogue old papers," said she, when Holmes had explained gently but plainly the nature of the evidence found in her room. "My grandmother spoke of her father until the day she died, and always with the same conviction that he had been wronged and silenced, and that no one had ever troubled to learn the truth of what became of him. I made it my purpose, when the opportunity of this position arose, to learn that truth myself, whatever it might cost me." "And having learned it," said Holmes, "you confronted Sir Edmund." "I did. 3 nights ago, in this very room, I told him plainly what I had discovered, and I will not deny that I hoped, in doing so, to see some measure of justice done for my grandfather's memory, however late in coming." "And his response?" Here Miss Vale's composure, which had held through the recitation of her own suspicions and researches, softened into something closer to genuine emotion. "He did not deny it, Mr. Holmes. He wept. He told me that he had carried the knowledge of what had happened to my grandfather for nearly 50 years, and that it had never once ceased to trouble him, though he had lacked, until that moment, the courage to make it right. He promised me that he would expose the fraud publicly, restore the disputed land to the village, and see that my grandfather's name was cleared of the false report of his desertion. I left him alive, Mr. Holmes, and I left him, I believed, resolved at last to do what honour had long demanded of him. You can offer no proof of this final conversation? None beyond my own word, which I am aware carries little weight against the evidence Inspector Lestrade has assembled against me. But I did not kill him, Mr. Holmes. I had, at the very moment of his death, every reason in the world to wish him alive, for it was only in his confession, freely and publicly made, that my grandfather's memory could be truly restored. His death has robbed me of that as surely as it robbed him of his own atonement." Holmes regarded her for a long moment in silence, and I saw in his face that quality of close, deliberate attention which I had learned, over many years, to trust above almost any other evidence the case might offer. "I am inclined to believe you," said he at last, "though I do not ask you to take comfort in that inclination alone, for Inspector Lestrade's evidence, however I may ultimately judge its weight, is not to be lightly dismissed by a jury less familiar with the finer points of chemical analysis than I am myself." He rose and moved toward the door, then paused, and turned back with a question that I confess had not, until that moment, occurred to me at all. If Sir Edmund intended to repair the wrong done to your family, Miss Vale, if he meant to confess the fraud publicly and restore what had been taken, then I would ask you to consider one thing only. Who among this household had the most to lose, not from Sir Edmund's continued silence, but from his sudden and belated honesty? Miss Vale looked up at him, and I saw understanding dawn slowly across her tired features, though she said nothing further, and Holmes, with a small bow, withdrew and left her to her thoughts. "You do not believe Lestrade's case against her," I said, as we walked together down the corridor. "I believe Lestrade has assembled a case, Watson, which is not at all the same thing as believing he has found the truth. A confession of guilt regarding an old wrong is a strange preface to a fresh murder committed for its concealment. It is a far more natural preface, I think, to a murder committed to prevent that confession from ever being made at all." Chapter 8. The Wrong Poison. Holmes spent the greater part of that afternoon shut away in the small chemical laboratory he had improvised from a disused pantry off the servants' hall, a proceeding that had at first excited Lestrade's derision, and later, as the hours wore on without a word from within, something closer to uneasy curiosity. I was permitted to join him only toward evening, when I found him surrounded by a litter of test tubes, a spirit lamp burning steadily upon the table, and an expression upon his face that I recognised, with some relief, as the particular satisfaction he wore when a difficult calculation had at last resolved itself. "You have found something." "I have found several things, Watson, though I confess the most important of them is a negative rather than a positive result, which is a distinction the law is generally slow to appreciate." He held up a small vial for my inspection. "This is a preparation of the substance found in Sir Edmund's brandy glass, matched as nearly as I can contrive against the sample taken from Miss Vale's chemicals. It is, as Lestrade's analyst correctly determined, capable of producing death, under sufficient concentration and given sufficient time." "Then the case against her stands." "The case against her falls, Watson, upon a single point of arithmetic that the county analyst appears not to have troubled himself to calculate. I have here reproduced, so far as the evidence permits, the approximate quantity of the substance present in that glass. It is not nearly sufficient to have caused death within the period we know to have elapsed between Sir Edmund's last sighting alive and the discovery of his body. A man might have taken that glass, Watson, and lived to finish a second. Then what killed him? That is the question I have spent the afternoon answering, and I believe I have now done so." He drew from his coat a small paper packet, folded with the particular neatness I had come to associate with his most careful work. "This I obtained this morning, with Dr. Fenwick's rather startled permission, from Sir Edmund's own medicine chest. It is his heart preparation, taken regularly according to Fenwick, for a condition of some years' standing, and taken always, I am told, in a precisely measured dose." "You believe it was tampered with?" "I believe it was administered, Watson, not tampered with, which is a rather different proposition, and one considerably more difficult to detect. A man accustomed to a small daily dose of a powerful preparation may be given a considerably larger quantity, disguised within some harmless vehicle, a cup of tea, a glass of tonic water, without any alteration whatever in the appearance, taste, or immediate effect of the substance he habitually takes. The overdose, once administered, requires several hours to produce its full and fatal effect, which accounts admirably for the discrepancy that has troubled me since the first night of our investigation, namely, that Sir Edmund was found dead at an hour considerably later than the period during which, by every account, he was last seen alive and apparently in ordinary health. And the medicine bottle found beneath the table? A blind, Watson, and not a very skilfully contrived one, once its purpose is understood. It was placed there after Sir Edmund had already collapsed, in order to suggest that whatever killed him had been taken at the very moment of his death, and to direct suspicion toward the brandy glass beside it, and thereby, by a natural progression of thought, toward whoever might be shown to have had access to that glass. Then who administered the fatal dose, and when? Holmes didn't answer at once, but drew from his notebook a page upon which he'd set down, in his small, precise hand, a chronology of the household's movements upon the day preceding Sir Edmund's death. The dose, if my calculation is correct, must have been given some hours before death occurred, which places its administration in the early afternoon, at a period when I find, upon inquiry among the servants, that Sir Edmund took a tray of refreshment in his study, while occupied with certain legal papers. "Fenwick," I said, my thoughts leaping at once to the physician's evident familiarity with the dosage and its dangers. "A natural conclusion, Watson, and one I confess I entertained myself until this morning, when I learned, upon inquiry at the village, that Dr. Fenwick was engaged throughout the whole of that afternoon in attending a difficult confinement at a farmhouse some 3 miles distant, a fact to which no fewer than 4 persons, including the child's own grandmother, are prepared to testify. Whoever administered that dose, it was not Matthew Fenwick. Then who else had knowledge enough of his medical routine and access enough to his refreshment to accomplish it?" Holmes rose and moved to the window, looking out over the darkening park with an expression I had seen upon his face before, at the culmination of some long and difficult chain of reasoning, when the final link, though not yet proven beyond dispute, had nonetheless revealed itself to his private satisfaction. "There is one man in this household, Watson, who spent that particular afternoon closeted with Sir Edmund over his legal papers, who ordered the tray of refreshment brought to the study with his own hand, and who has, throughout this investigation, displayed a courtesy so uniform and an explanation so ready for every inconvenient fact, that I confess it began to trouble me from the very first evening of our acquaintance with this house. Trent." "Silas Trent," Holmes agreed, "though I will not yet call the case complete, for a man's opportunity, however suggestive, is not his conviction, and I require one further piece of evidence before I am prepared to lay the whole matter before Lestrade, with the confidence it will demand. I return, Watson, to the map. The map again. The map again. I have examined the erasure and the redrawn boundary with some care, but I have not yet examined, with sufficient precision, the ink with which that boundary was redrawn. If my suspicion regarding its composition proves correct, it will furnish us with a fact that neither testimony nor circumstance can supply, a fact fixed and immutable, belonging to chemistry rather than to memory, and it is upon such facts, Watson, far more than upon the uncertain evidence of frightened or guilty faces, that I have always preferred to build my final case." He said no more that evening, but I observed him sit long into the night beside the lamp in our sitting-room, a small fragment of the parish map spread before him, and a look upon his face that told me, as surely as any words could have done, that the end of our inquiry was now very near. Chapter 9. The Bill That Never Existed. Holmes requested through Lestrade that the entire household assemble in the library that evening, a request which the inspector granted with evident reluctance, tempered, I thought, by a curiosity he was too honest a man entirely to conceal. It was a strange gathering that convened beneath the tall shelves and dying fire. Charles Harcourt, pale and watchful. Miss Vale, composed once more, though her eyes moved often toward Holmes, as though seeking some confirmation of the hope his question in the parlour had lately kindled in her. Dr. Fenwick sunk into a chair by the hearth like a man bearing a weight he could no longer wholly support. And Mr. Silas Trent, upright, attentive, and possessed, even now, of that same unhurried courtesy that had marked every hour of our acquaintance with him. Holmes stood before the fire and began, as was his custom, not with an accusation, but with a correction. "We have all of us, myself included, laboured for some days under a false assumption regarding the origin of this case, and I think it best, before I proceed further, to set that assumption right. It has been supposed from the first that the fraudulent alteration of the enclosure schedule was the work of Sir Edmund's father, committed in the year 1879 for the enlargement of his own estate. I believed this myself until this afternoon. It is not the truth." Charles stirred in his chair. "Not the truth, Mr. Holmes. Then what is?" "The original Bill of Enclosure, as read and passed by Parliament, was entirely lawful and disturbed no man's rightful property. The fraud was committed afterward, and by another hand entirely, that of a junior clerk employed in the drafting and registration of such documents, a young man who substituted a forged schedule for the true one before the papers were finally deposited, thereby transferring to the Harcourt estate several acres of common land that no Act of Parliament had ever intended it to receive. Trent's father, I said, though I had guessed as much some days before. Trent's father, Holmes confirmed, who performed this service, I believe, at the instigation and for the considerable reward of Sir Edmund's father, and who thereby laid the foundation of a secret that has poisoned this family and this house for 2 generations, and has now claimed, within the space of 1 week, a second life. Mr. Trent had not moved, nor had his countenance altered by so much as a flicker, but I observed that his hands folded upon his knee had grown very still, in the particular manner of a man exerting considerable effort to appear at ease. Abel Mercer, Holmes continued, discovered the substitution, or came near enough to it to threaten exposure, and confronted 3 young men, Edmund Harcourt, Matthew Fenwick, and Silas Trent, upon the very boundary his family had been robbed of. What followed was not, I believe, murder in the sense the law generally intends that word. There was a quarrel. There was perhaps a struggle none of the 3 young men had truly wished for. Mercer fell from the ledge of the abandoned quarry beyond that wall and did not rise again. Dr. Fenwick made a low sound but did not speak. The 3 of them, frightened beyond the courage of honest confession, concealed what had happened and put about the story of Mercer's departure for Canada, a story none of them, I think, ever expected to hold for very long, and which held in the event for very nearly 50 years. Sir Edmund carried the weight of that concealment for the whole of his remaining life. It was, I believe, the true cause of his composure at our first meeting, a composure that concealed not merely fear of exposure, but something nearer to exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who has carried a single unbearable fact for longer than most men carry any burden at all. And my grandfather's daughter, Miss Vale said quietly, came at last to ask the question none of them had ever answered. Your researches, Miss Vale, forced Sir Edmund to confront a reckoning he had perhaps always known must come. He resolved, as you have told us, to confess the whole truth publicly, to restore the disputed land, and to clear your grandfather's name. It was a resolution that would have ruined the Harcourt family's reputation, certainly, but a family's reputation, however painful its loss, is a burden that can, in time, be borne and outlived. It was not, however, the only reputation at stake. Holmes turned for the first time directly toward Mr. Trent. A public confession implicating the original fraud would not merely have exposed the Harcourts, it would have exposed your father's role in drafting the forged schedule, Mr. Trent, and would very probably have called into question the validity of every subsequent transaction in which that fraudulent boundary had played any part, transactions which you yourself, as your father's successor in the management of this estate's legal affairs, have administered for the better part of 30 years. Sir Edmund's confession threatened not merely a name, but a livelihood, and very possibly a prosecution reaching backward through decades of settled property, sales and inheritances that your own office had certified as sound. This is conjecture, Mr. Holmes, said Trent, and his voice, though carefully controlled, had lost something of its habitual smoothness. Ingenious conjecture, I grant you, but conjecture none the less. It was conjecture, Holmes agreed, until this afternoon, when I completed my examination of the parish map in the room where Sir Edmund died. The boundary line upon that map has indeed been altered, Mr. Trent, but not as I first supposed in 1879. I have subjected the ink of that redrawn line to careful chemical analysis, and I find it to be a synthetic preparation, developed and manufactured only within the last several years, entirely unavailable to any hand at work in the 19th century. A silence fell upon the room that I can compare to nothing so much as the stillness before a summer storm breaks. You altered that map yourself, Mr. Trent, and recently, in order to support a false version of the original fraud, one that would, had it been believed, have shifted the burden of guilt away from your own father and onto some invented irregularity in the bill itself. You then administered, in the tray of refreshment, you brought Sir Edmund with your own hand upon the afternoon of his death, an overdose of his heart preparation sufficient to kill him within a period of some hours, and calculated in its timing to fall after your own departure from the house on legitimate business, thereby furnishing yourself with the appearance of an alibi. You placed the medicine bottle beneath the table to suggest a poisoning more immediate and more readily traced to Dr. Fenwick, and when that theory failed to satisfy Inspector Lestrade so completely as you had hoped, you were content to let suspicion fall first upon Mr. Harcourt, and then, with rather more assistance from the evidence in her room than I believe you yourself supplied, upon Miss Vale. Trent said nothing at all. He did not confess, then or afterward, and Holmes, I observed, did not press him to it, remarking to me later that a man who has kept one secret successfully for 30 years is rarely persuaded to abandon the habit of silence merely because he has been discovered. But the physical evidence, laid out before Lestrade with the same patient precision that had characterized the whole of Holmes's inquiry, was sufficient, and it was in silence, and with his habitual composure at last entirely extinguished, that Silas Trent was led from the library and placed under arrest for the murder of Sir Edmund Harcourt. Chapter 10. What the Earth Remembers. Silas Trent was formally charged within the week with the murder of Sir Edmund Harcourt, and it fell to Lestrade, whose respect for Holmes's methods had grown, I think, rather more than his professional pride would readily admit, to complete the investigation that Holmes's reasoning had set in motion. A search of Trent's London office, conducted with a thoroughness that did the inspector considerable credit, uncovered, concealed within a false partition at the back of an old deed box. The original bill of enclosure as it had truly stood before its schedule was altered, together with a quantity of correspondence between the elder Trent and Sir Edmund's father, that left no reasonable doubt as to the nature and origin of the fraud committed half a century before. Trent himself, I am told, said little at his trial beyond what the law required of him, and offered no defence beyond a formal denial that satisfied no one, least of all, I believe, himself. He was a man, Holmes remarked to me afterward, who had spent his entire life maintaining the appearance of order and propriety over a foundation he had known, since early manhood, to be entirely rotten, and I think the effort of that long pretence had worn upon him more heavily than any of us, saving perhaps Holmes himself, had ever fully appreciated. The matter of Abel Mercer's remains was resolved not many days later, when a search of the disused quarry beyond the old boundary wall, undertaken at Holmes's particular suggestion, and conducted with the sober assistance of the local constabulary, uncovered what little the passage of 50 years had left of the unfortunate man. It was a discovery that brought Miss Vale, when she learned of it, to a grief tempered, I thought, with something very near to peace, for whatever sorrow remained in the confirmation of what she had long suspected, there was comfort also in knowing, at last and beyond doubt, what had truly become of her grandfather, and in seeing his name, so long clouded by the false report of desertion, restored to its proper honour in the parish record. Charles Harcourt, who inherited Alderwick Hall and all its revenues upon his uncle's death, proved himself, in the weeks that followed, a rather better man than the anxious, debt-burdened figure we had first encountered might have suggested. Learning the full history of the disputed acreage, and of his uncle's final unspoken intention to make restitution, he voluntarily transferred the whole of the contested land into a trust for the benefit of the village, fulfilling, though by a path his uncle had never lived to walk himself, the restitution Sir Edmund had promised in his last conversation with Miss Vale. Dr. Fenwick did not escape the reckoning that history had so long deferred. He came forward of his own accord before any magistrate required it of him, and gave a full account of his part in concealing Mercer's death upon that distant night, submitting himself, with a dignity I confess I had not expected of him, to whatever consequence the law might see fit to impose. That the years had softened the law's severity toward an old man's youthful crime, committed in panic rather than malice, was perhaps the only mercy the case afforded him. But I believe he accepted even the lightest sentence as considerably less than his conscience had long demanded of him. Miss Vale remained at Alderwick Hall through the following spring, completing, at Charles Harcourt's particular request, a full history of the Enclosure dispute for the parish records, a work in which her grandfather's name was set down at last, not as a man who had abandoned his family for the promise of Canada, but as one who had died defending a right that had truly been his own. We took our leave of Alderwick Hall on a grey morning not unlike the one upon which we'd first arrived, and travelled back to London by the same railway line, though I confess the journey seemed to me a very different one, lightened by the resolution of a case that had, for some days, weighed upon my spirits as heavily as any I had shared with my friend. "It is a curious thing, Watson," said Holmes, as the Surrey countryside slipped past the carriage window, "how readily we assume that a crime belongs entirely to the moment of its commission. This case appeared, upon its surface, a matter of inheritance, of a nephew's debts, of a household's present rivalries and resentments. Lestrade, you will recall, was prepared from the very first evening to close it upon precisely such grounds, and yet none of those things caused it. None of them, Watson, not truly. Charles Harcourt's debts were real enough, but they explain nothing that a 50-year-old fraud does not explain a great deal more completely. The murder of Sir Edmund Harcourt began, in the truest sense, not 3 nights before we were summoned to Alderwick Hall, but very nearly 50 years earlier, upon a boundary wall that has long since been rebuilt, in a quarrel between 4 young men, none of whom, I think, fully understood at the time what they were setting in motion. It seems a hard thing, I said, that a man should die for a wrong committed before he was born. It is a hard thing, and yet I think you mistake the nature of it, Watson. Silas Trent did not die for his father's sin. He killed to protect it, which is a very different matter, and one for which the law, rightly, holds him fully accountable. His father's crime was a wrong done to Abel Mercer. His own crime was a wrong done to Sir Edmund, and to truth itself, and it is for that second wrong, committed with full knowledge and full deliberation, that he must now answer. We were silent for some time after that, and I found myself gazing out at the passing fields, their boundaries marked by hedgerows and low stone walls that had stood in many cases for centuries beyond counting, indifferent alike to the fortunes they enclosed and the quarrels they had once provoked. "There is a lesson in it, I think," I said at last, though I hardly know how to phrase it properly. "Perhaps only this, Watson," said Holmes, closing his eyes as the train gathered speed toward London. "That time may soften the memory of what was done, and may even persuade the guilty for a while that their crime has been forgotten, but it does not alter the fact of it. A boundary, once falsely drawn, remains false however many years pass over it, and buried truth, like an old landmark beneath fresh soil, has a curious and stubborn habit of remaining exactly where it was left, waiting, with the patience of the earth itself, for someone at last to dig it up.